Now, imagine a man standing alone beside a glacial lake in the Swiss Alps. It is early August 1881. The water is an impossible shade of turquoise, so clear you can see the stones at the bottom shimmering like something dreamed rather than real. Above the lake, the mountains rise in every direction, enormous and silent, their peaks draped in snow that has not melted in 10,000 years. And at the edge of the water, there is a boulder, a massive pyramidal rock as tall as a house, sitting at the shoreline as though it had been placed there deliberately by some ancient hand. The man stops walking. He stares at the rock. And then, without warning, a thought strikes him. Not an ordinary thought. Not a new interpretation of an old problem or a clever turn of phrase. Something far more violent than that. A thought so heavy and so bright that it will take him the rest of his life to carry it. He will later describe this moment with a single cryptic note scrawled on a piece of paper, 6,000 feet beyond man and time. The man's name was Friedrich Nietzsche, and the thought that seized him beside that lake would become one of the most provocative and misunderstood ideas in the entire history of philosophy. He called it the eternal recurrence, the eternal return of the same. And tonight, as you settle into the stillness of approaching sleep, we are going to follow this idea from its violent birth on that alpine shoreline all the way through the storms of Nietzsche's extraordinary and devastating life. Because eternal return is not merely an intellectual puzzle, it is a mirror, and what it shows you when you dare to look into it depends entirely on the kind of life you have been living. Here is the question at its heart, stripped of all academic polish. What if a demon crept into the most solitary moment of your most solitary night and whispered to you that this life, exactly as you have lived it, with every sorrow and every joy and every tedious afternoon and every breathless moment of love, must be repeated by you identically for all eternity? Nothing new, nothing altered, every stubbed toe, every betrayal, every laugh, every loss. The same spider, in the same corner of the same room, the same moonlight falling through the same window, forever. Would you collapse under the weight of that thought? Or would you call the demon a god and thank him for the most divine thing you had ever heard? That is the question Nietzsche asked. And it was not an easy question for him, because the man who posed it was not living an enviable life. He was lonely, sick, nearly blind, frequently in pain so severe he could not leave his bed for days. He had been rejected by the woman he loved. He had been abandoned by his closest friend. His books were ignored by the intellectual world he had hoped to transform. And yet, he claimed that this thought, the thought that everything returns unchanged, was the highest formula of affirmation that is at all attainable. To understand why, and to feel the true weight of what he was offering, we need to begin much earlier. We need to go back to a small village in Prussia and to a little boy standing beside his father's grave. Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche was born on October 15, 1844, in the village of Rocken, a quiet cluster of houses near Leipzig in the Prussian province of Saxony. His father, Karl Ludwig Nietzsche, was a Lutheran pastor, a gentle and educated man who had been appointed to his parish through the personal recommendation of King Friedrich Wilhelm IV of Prussia. The boy was named after the king, born on the king's own birthday, and there was a sense in the family that this child had arrived under favorable stars. But those stars burned out quickly. When Friedrich was 4 years old, his father began suffering from what the doctors of the time could only describe as softening of the brain. For an entire year, the family watched Karl Ludwig deteriorate. The headaches, the confusion, the long periods of silence followed by episodes of agony. The man who had stood before his congregation each Sunday and spoken of God's mercy was now unable to recognize his own children. He died in July of 1849. Friedrich was not yet 5. 6 months later, the boy's younger brother Ludwig Joseph died as well. He was only 2 years old. According to family legend, Friedrich had dreamed of his brother's death before it happened, a dream in which a grave opened and a small figure in white was carried down into the earth. Whether or not the dream actually occurred, it tells us something about the atmosphere of loss that surrounded this child from his earliest years. Death was not an abstraction in the Nietzsche household. It was a presence, that sat at the dinner table and slept in the next room. After the deaths, Friedrich's mother Franziska moved the family to the small city of Naumburg. They settled into a household that was entirely female. His mother, his younger sister Elizabeth, his paternal grandmother, and two aunts. There was no male figure in the home. Friedrich grew up surrounded by piety and grief, and the quiet industry of women who had learned to manage sorrow by keeping busy. He idealized his dead father, constructing from fragments of memory and family stories an image of a man he could barely remember. That idealization, that longing for a father who existed more in imagination than in fact, would echo through his entire life, drawing him toward older men he could admire, and then inevitably rebel against. There is a detail about Nietzsche's childhood that biographers often mention in passing, but that deserves more attention. He had a recurring nightmare as a young boy. In the dream, he heard organ music rising from the church where his father had preached, and then a figure in white was carried from the church into the graveyard. He reportedly told his mother about this dream shortly before his brother Ludwig Joseph died. Whether the dream actually predicted the death, or whether memory reshaped the dream after the fact, does not really matter. What matters is the psychological landscape it reveals. This was a child who associated sleep with death, music with grief, and the church with burial. The religion that was supposed to provide comfort had become inseparable from loss, and that tangled relationship between faith and suffering would drive his thinking for the rest of his life. In school at Naumburg, Friedrich was a serious and somewhat isolated child. His classmates called him the little pastor because of his grave manner and his habit of reciting biblical passages from memory. He did not fit easily among other children. He was too earnest, too intense, too aware of sorrows that most children his age had not yet encountered. But he formed two close friendships with boys named Wilhelm Pinder and Gustav Krug, and these friendships gave him something his all-female household could not: the experience of male companionship, of rough play and competition, and the kind of loyalty that boys forge through shared adventures. The boy was brilliant. That much was obvious from the beginning. He read voraciously, he wrote poems, he composed music, he formed a small club with friends to discuss literature and art. And when he was 14, he won a scholarship to Schulpforta, one of the most prestigious boarding schools in all of Germany. There, over the next 6 years, he received a ferocious classical education. Greek, Latin, Hebrew, French. He read the ancient texts in their original languages. He absorbed the rhythms of Sophocles and Plato and Thucydides until they became part of his own voice. The intellectual machinery he would later use to dismantle 2,000 years of Western moral philosophy was being assembled, piece by precise piece, in those school years. After Schulpforta, he enrolled at the University of Bonn with the intention of following his father into the Lutheran ministry. But something cracked open during his first semester. Whether it was the freedom of university life, the encounter with modern biblical criticism, or simply the natural rebellion of a mind too powerful for the faith it had inherited, Nietzsche abandoned theology almost immediately. He wrote an essay declaring that historical evidence discredited the central claims of Christianity. The son of a dead pastor had turned his back on God. Or more precisely, he had begun to suspect that God had already turned his back on humanity, and that no one had yet noticed. He transferred to the University of Leipzig to study philology, the scholarly analysis of ancient languages and texts. And it was there, in a second-hand bookshop, that he experienced what he would later describe as one of the defining moments of his intellectual life. He picked up a copy of Arthur Schopenhauer's major work, The World as Will and Representation. He took it home, began reading, and did not stop. For 2 weeks, he lived inside that book, getting only 4 hours of sleep a night, barely eating, completely consumed. Schopenhauer's vision of the world as a place of blind, ceaseless striving, of suffering without redemption, of desire that could never be permanently satisfied, struck the young Nietzsche with the force of revelation. Here was a philosopher who did not flinch from the darkness. Here was someone who looked at existence without the comfortable filters of religious hope and described what he saw with brutal honesty. Nietzsche would eventually reject Schopenhauer's conclusions, particularly his recommendation that we should deny the will and seek a kind of Buddhist quietude. But the encounter set the trajectory. From that moment forward, Nietzsche would be a philosopher of life's darkest questions, not to escape them, but to find within them something worth affirming. His academic brilliance drew attention. At Leipzig, his professor Friedrich Nietzsche was so impressed that he recommended Nietzsche for a position at the University of Basel in Switzerland. In 1869, at the age of 24, Friedrich Nietzsche was appointed to a full professorship. He had not even completed his doctoral dissertation. The university granted him his doctorate based on his published work alone, waiving the usual requirements. He was the youngest person ever to hold such a position at Basel. Around this same time, he formed what would become the most turbulent friendship of his life. Richard Wagner, the composer, was living near Basel with his companion Cosima von Bülow, and Nietzsche was invited into their circle. For a young man who had lost his father at 4 and spent his childhood seeking male figures to admire, Wagner was intoxicating. Here was a genius, a revolutionary, a man who spoke of art as the highest expression of human spirit. Nietzsche visited the Wagner household regularly. He played piano for them. He listened to Wagner's theories about the future of German culture. He wrote his first book, The Birth of Tragedy, largely under Wagner's spell. But even as this friendship was flowering, Nietzsche's body was beginning to fail. The headaches that had plagued him intermittently since childhood were growing worse. Severe, blinding migraines that confined him to darkened rooms for days. Nausea, so intense that he could not keep food down. His eyesight deteriorated until he could barely read. Modern scholars believe he may have been suffering from a slowly growing tumor behind his right eye, a retroorbital meningioma that would have produced exactly these symptoms. Whatever the medical cause, the practical reality was this. By his early 30s, Friedrich Nietzsche was in near constant physical distress. In 1879, his health had deteriorated to the point where he could no longer teach. He resigned from his professorship at Basel, receiving a modest pension that would be his only reliable income for the rest of his sane life. And so began the wandering years. For the next decade, Nietzsche moved restlessly through Europe, searching for places where the climate might ease his suffering. Cheap boarding houses in the Italian Riviera, mountain villages in Switzerland, the south of France. He traveled with a small trunk, a few books, and a portable writing desk. He had almost no money. His old friends drifted away one by one. Picture the daily reality of his existence during these years, because it matters for understanding what the eternal return meant when it came from this particular man. He would wake, often after a night of broken sleep, to a headache already building behind his eyes. On good days, the pain was manageable enough for him to write for a few hours, bent close to the page because his eyesight was failing, using a pencil because the scraping of a nib against paper was sometimes too loud for his sensitized nerves. On bad days, he could do nothing but lie in a darkened room with a wet cloth over his eyes, waiting for the storm in his skull to pass. He ate simply. He walked when he could. He had conversations almost exclusively through letters. His social world was a handful of correspondents who rarely visited and sometimes went months without writing back. The loneliness was not romantic. It was grinding. There is a difference between solitude chosen and solitude imposed. And while Nietzsche sometimes wrote about his isolation as though it were a philosophical achievement, his letters reveal the cost. He missed human touch. He missed laughter. He missed the warmth of being known by someone who cared about more than his ideas. And yet this very loneliness became the crucible in which his most original thoughts were forged. Without the distractions of academic life, without the compromises required by social belonging, without the temptation to soften his ideas for the sake of approval, Nietzsche was free to think with an honesty that bordered on self-destruction. Wagner, the great surrogate father, had become someone Nietzsche could no longer admire. The break between them was partly philosophical and partly personal. Nietzsche came to see Wagner's art as manipulative, his nationalism as dangerous, his Christianity as a betrayal of everything they had once shared. The rupture left a wound that never fully healed. And yet, Paradoxically, as Nietzsche's outer life became smaller and more confined by suffering, his inner life expanded enormously. The books he wrote during these wandering years, Human, All Too Human, Daybreak, The Gay Science, each one pushed further into territory that no philosopher had dared to map. He was developing a new kind of philosophy, not the grand systematic constructions of Hegel or Kant, but something sharper, more personal, more dangerous. Aphorisms that cut like surgical instruments, questions that dismantled assumptions most people did not even know they held. It was during this period of extreme isolation and creative ferment that he arrived in Sils Maria for the first time in the summer of 1881. He had traveled from the Italian mountain resort of Recaro in the Veneto, where he had suffered from daily seizures and vomiting, desperately seeking a climate that would quiet his screaming nervous system. He longed, as he wrote in a letter, for a land with a lot of shade, an eternally blue sky, an equally strong sea wind from morning till evening, without thunderstorms. The high Alps were the closest he would come to that dream. Sils Maria sits on a narrow strip of land between two alpine lakes at an elevation of roughly 2,000 meters. The air is thin and cold, even in summer. The lakes, Sils and Silvaplana, lie side by side like a pair of enormous eyes staring up at the sky. Above them, the peaks of the Albula Alps crowd together, their surfaces scarred by glaciers older than human civilization. Nietzsche fell in love with the place immediately. Despite the thunderstorms that tormented his sensitive nervous system, despite the headaches and the loneliness, there was something about the scale of the landscape that matched the scale of his thinking. He walked. That was his primary activity. Long walks along the shores of the lakes, through forests of stone pine and larch, up into meadows where the wildflowers grew in colors so vivid they seemed hallucinatory. He walked, and he thought, and he scribbled notes in small notebooks that he could barely see to read. And then came the day, early August. He was walking along the shore of Lake Silvaplana when he came upon the pyramidal boulder near the village of Surley. It was a glacial, erratic, a stone transported miles from its origin by the movement of ice across millennia, and then deposited here, beside this particular lake, in this particular spot, as though it had been waiting for him. He stopped. And the thought arrived. He wrote to his friend Peter Gast on August 14th, still vibrating with the force of what had happened. On my horizon thoughts rise, he wrote, and what thoughts he could not yet articulate it fully. He knew only that something had shifted at the deepest level of his understanding. The note he made on the paper, 6,000 feet beyond man and time, suggested that he felt the thought had come from somewhere outside ordinary human experience, as though the altitude, the thin air, the glacial silence had opened a channel between his mind and something much larger. What was the thought? In its simplest form, it was this: everything that has happened will happen again. Everything that exists will exist again. The universe, with all its contents, with every particle and every event, and every suffering, and every joy, will cycle back upon itself and repeat, identically, for all eternity. And you, standing here thinking this thought, will stand here and think it again, and again, and again, without end. The effect on Nietzsche was immediate and profound. He wept. He trembled. He felt by his own account that he had touched something so large and so fundamental that it would take centuries for humanity to fully absorb it. In his notebooks, he called the eternal return the highest formula of affirmation that is at all attainable. In a letter to his friend Peter Gast, he wrote with an intensity that borders on ecstasy, describing thoughts rising on his horizon that were unlike anything he had ever experienced. He would later write that this idea alone would need thousands of years to develop properly. Coming from a man who was not given to false modesty about the significance of his own contributions, this is a remarkable claim. And there is something about the setting that feels essential to the idea itself. The eternal return is not a thought that could have been born in a library or a lecture hall. It needed the mountains. It needed the ancient silence of glacial stone. It needed the sight of water that had been flowing through these valleys since before human beings existed and would continue flowing long after the last human being had disappeared. The eternal return is, in a sense, a philosophical translation of what the Alps themselves communicate to anyone who stands among them long enough. That the scale of time exceeds anything the human mind can comfortably hold, and that within that immensity, our individual lives are both infinitely small and perhaps for that very reason, infinitely precious. Now, at first glance, this might seem like nothing more than an interesting cosmological speculation. Ancient and modern thinkers had proposed cyclical models of the universe before, but Nietzsche was not primarily interested in whether the eternal return was scientifically true. What interested him was what happens to a person when they take this thought seriously. What happens to your relationship with your own life when you imagine that it will repeat, unchanged, forever? To understand why this thought carried such explosive force for Nietzsche, we need to understand the crisis that preceded it. Because the eternal return was not born in a vacuum. It was born as a response to what Nietzsche considered the most catastrophic event in the history of Western civilization. And that event was the death of God. In section 125 of The Gay Science, a book he was working on during that very summer in Sils Maria, Nietzsche tells a parable that has haunted readers for nearly a century and a half. A madman lights a lantern in the bright morning and runs to the marketplace crying out, "I seek God! I seek God!" The people in the marketplace, many of whom do not believe in God, laugh at him. But the madman is not a fool. He knows exactly what has happened and what it means. "We have killed him," he declares. "You and I. All of us are his murderers." This is not a celebration. Nietzsche was not dancing on a grave, he was diagnosing a catastrophe. For nearly 2,000 years, Western civilization had organized itself around the idea that a benevolent God created the universe, gave it purpose, and established a moral order that human beings were obligated to obey. Heaven rewarded virtue. Hell punished vice. Suffering was meaningful because it served some larger plan. Life had a destination. Death was not the end. And now all of that was gone. Not because someone had disproved it in a laboratory, but because the slow accumulation of scientific knowledge, historical criticism, and philosophical skepticism had gradually eroded the foundations upon which the entire structure rested. The churches were still standing, the prayers were still being recited, but the faith that gave those words their power was draining away like water from a cracked vessel. Nietzsche saw, with terrifying clarity, what this meant. Without God, there was no cosmic purpose. Without cosmic purpose, there was no inherent meaning to human suffering. Without inherent meaning to suffering, there was no reason not to despair. The entire moral architecture of the West, its ideas about right and wrong, its confidence that the universe was ultimately just, its hope that goodness would be rewarded, all of it rested on a foundation that was crumbling. Think about what this means in practical terms. For centuries, a farmer burying his child could comfort himself with the belief that the child was in heaven, that God had a plan, that the suffering served a purpose he could not yet see. A soldier dying on a battlefield could believe that his sacrifice mattered in some cosmic ledger. A woman enduring years of hardship could sustain herself with the conviction that justice would be done, if not in this life, then in the next. Remove all of that, and what remains? Just the suffering, just the loss, just the brute fact of a universe that does not care whether you live or die, whether you are good or evil, whether you struggle nobly or surrender in despair. Nietzsche understood that most people had not yet felt the full impact of this loss. The churches were still full. The moral vocabulary of Christianity was still in everyday use. People spoke of sin and redemption, right and wrong, heaven and hell, as though these concepts still carried the weight they once had. But Nietzsche could see that the substance behind the words was evaporating. The madman in the marketplace arrives too early. His audience laughs at him. They do not yet understand what they have done. But Nietzsche knew the understanding would come, and when it did, the consequences would be staggering. What Nietzsche feared most was not atheism itself, but what would rush in to fill the void. He called it nihilism, the conviction that nothing matters, that all values are arbitrary, that existence is a pointless accident in an indifferent cosmos. He saw nihilism not as a philosophical position to be debated, but as a psychological plague that would spread across Europe and eventually across the entire modern world. dissolving bonds of community, eroding the will to create, and leaving in its wake a civilization of exhausted, passive, pleasure-seeking creatures who had lost the capacity to take anything seriously. Previous philosophers had tried to build secular substitutes for religious meaning. The utilitarians offered the greatest happiness for the greatest number, but Nietzsche found their vision of happiness thin and uninspiring. Kant had offered duty for duty's sake, but Nietzsche suspected that Kantian morality was simply Christian morality, with the theology removed. The same obedience, the same guilt, the same denial of earthly life. Schopenhauer had faced the void honestly, but his conclusion, that the best response to existence was to withdraw from it, struck Nietzsche as the opposite of what was needed. What was needed, Nietzsche believed, was a way to affirm life so completely that even its worst moments could be embraced without reservation, not endured, not tolerated, not explained away, embraced, loved, chosen. And that is exactly what the eternal return demands. If this life, with all its suffering, is the only life there is, and if it will repeat forever, then you cannot defer meaning to an afterlife or to a future golden age. Meaning must be found here, in this breath, in this moment, in this imperfect, painful, beautiful existence. The eternal return takes the idea that this life is all there is and gives it infinite weight. In section 341 of The Gay Science, titled The Greatest Weight, Nietzsche presents the thought experiment in its most compressed and devastating form. He asks you to imagine the loneliest moment of your loneliest night. A demon steals into that solitude and says to you, "This life as you now live it and have lived it, you will have to live once more and innumerable times more. There will be nothing new in it, but every pain and every joy and every thought and sigh and everything unspeakably small or great in your life will return to you, all in the same succession and sequence. Even this spider and this moonlight between the trees, and even this moment and I myself, the eternal hourglass of existence, is turned upside down again and again, and you with it speck of dust." Notice how specific Nietzsche makes it. Not just the big events, the births and deaths and turning points, but the spider, the moonlight, the tiny forgettable details that you barely register as they pass. All of it, unchanged, returning. The question he then poses is stark. Would you throw yourself down and gnash your teeth and curse the demon who spoke this way? Or have you once experienced a tremendous moment when you would have answered him, "You are a god, and never have I heard anything more divine"? This is not really a question about cosmology. It is a question about your relationship with your own existence. It is asking, do you love your life enough to want it back? All of it, including the worst parts, because the eternal return does not allow you to edit. You cannot say yes to the joys and no to the sorrows. The deal is all or nothing. Every heartbreak comes with every triumph. Every illness comes with every recovery. Every loss comes with every love. Think about what the demon is actually proposing, not a general repetition of something vaguely similar to your life, in every detail. The afternoon when you were 7 years old and skinned your knee on the pavement and lay on the hot concrete crying while the blood ran down your shin. The first time someone told you they loved you and you believed them. The night you could not sleep because a decision you had made was eating at you, turning over and over in your stomach like a stone. The morning you woke up and, for no reason you could explain, felt perfectly happy just to be alive. All of it. The tedium and the ecstasy and the long stretches of nothing in between. The relationships that ended badly, the friendships that faded without resolution. The words you said that you wish you could take back. The words you never said that you wish you had. And here is the part that makes the thought experiment truly devastating. The demon says there will be nothing new, not one moment of novelty, not one deviation from the script. You will not be able to learn from the repetition because you will not remember that it is a repetition. You will experience every moment with the same freshness and the same ignorance as the first time. You will make the same mistakes. You will fall in love with the same people. You will suffer the same losses. And you will never ever know that you have done all of this before. This feature of the thought experiment is crucial. Nietzsche is not asking whether you would like to relive your life knowing what you know now, with the chance to make better choices. That would be a fantasy of optimization. He is asking whether the life you have lived, exactly as it was, without any possibility of improvement, is something you can affirm. The eternal return strips away every escape hatch, no second chances, no do-overs, no growth through accumulated wisdom over multiple cycles. Just the same life, the same you, the same everything, repeated without variation for all eternity. And there is a second dimension to the thought that is easy to miss. Nietzsche says that this question, once taken seriously, would lie upon your actions as the greatest weight, meaning that it would change how you live going forward. If you knew that every choice you made would be your choice for eternity, would you still make the same choices? Would you still waste this afternoon? Would you still swallow that resentment instead of speaking honestly? Would you still defer your deepest ambitions for another year and another and another? The eternal return, understood this way, becomes a tool for cutting through complacency. It forces radical honesty about whether you are actually living the life you would choose or merely drifting through the life that happened to you. Now, Nietzsche did not invent the idea of cyclical time. He stood at the end of a long lineage of thinkers who had contemplated the possibility that the universe repeats itself. To understand what made his version so distinct and so powerful, it helps to trace the idea back through history and see how it evolved before reaching that pyramidal boulder beside Lake Silvaplana. The ancient Pythagoreans, followers of the Greek mathematician and mystic Pythagoras in the 6th and 5th centuries before the Common Era, believed in what they called the Great Year, a vast cosmic cycle, at the end of which all celestial bodies would return to their original positions and all events would begin again. This was not metaphor. They believed it literally. Somewhere in the turning of the heavens, the exact configuration that produced your birth would recur, and you would be born again, live the same life, make the same mistakes, love the same people, and die the same death. Imagine the weight of that belief. Imagine knowing, as you ate your evening meal or argued with a friend or watched the sunset, that you had done exactly this before an incalculable number of times, and would do it again, and that nothing you could do would change any of it. Empedocles, another pre-Socratic philosopher, described the cosmos as governed by two alternating forces: love, which draws elements together, and strife, which tears them apart. The universe oscillated eternally between these two poles, periodically achieving total unity under love and then fragmenting again under strife. Each cycle was identical to the last. Creation and destruction repeated in an endless rhythm, neither progressing nor declining, simply turning. There is something almost musical about this vision, a cosmos that breathes in and out, contracts and expands, like some enormous living thing dreaming and waking and dreaming again. The Stoics developed perhaps the most systematic version of the idea. They believed that the universe periodically undergoes a process they called ekpyrosis, a conflagration in which everything is consumed by divine fire. After the conflagration, the universe is reborn from the fire, reconstituted in exactly the same form, and the entire sequence of events plays out once more, detail for identical detail. This was not punishment. It was simply the nature of reality. The Stoic sage Chrysippus reportedly taught that after each conflagration the cosmos would be reborn, and Socrates would once again teach in Athens, would once again drink the hemlock, would once again die for philosophy. The wise person's task was to accept this truth with equanimity, to fulfill their role in the cosmic drama with dignity, knowing that they had fulfilled it before and would fulfill it again. In the traditions of South and East Asia, cyclical time takes different but equally powerful forms. The Hindu concept of samsara describes an ongoing wheel of birth, death, and rebirth, driven by karma and sustained by desire. The timescales involved are almost incomprehensible to the Western mind. A single cycle of creation and destruction, one breath of Brahma, lasts over 4 billion years. And there have been infinite such breaths. Buddhist philosophy shares this cyclical framework while offering a path of liberation from the cycle through enlightenment. The Buddha taught that the wheel of becoming is sustained by ignorance and craving, and that by extinguishing these, one can step off the wheel entirely into the stillness of nirvana. In both traditions, the repetition of existence is generally understood as something to be transcended rather than celebrated. The wheel turns, and the goal is to step off it. Even Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor and Stoic philosopher, meditated on the repetitive nature of human experience. He reminded himself that the dramas playing out in the Roman Senate were the same dramas that had played out in the courts of Alexander and in the assemblies of Athens. Nothing was truly new. The names changed, the costumes changed, but the essential human patterns, the ambitions and jealousies and brief moments of wisdom simply repeated themselves generation after generation. What separated Nietzsche from all of these predecessors was his emotional and philosophical response to the idea. The Pythagoreans treated it as cosmological fact. The Stoics treated it as a call to serene acceptance. The Eastern traditions treated it as a problem requiring liberation. But Nietzsche treated it as a call to love, not resignation, not escape, not indifference. Love. That was the revolution. The eternal return in Nietzsche's hands was not a description of how the universe works. It was a challenge. Can you love your life so completely that you would choose to have it back, unchanged forever? There was also a more immediate scientific context for Nietzsche's thinking. The 19th century had seen the development of thermodynamics, and the debate about the ultimate fate of the universe was very much alive. Some physicists and philosophers argued that the universe was running down, heading toward a state of maximum entropy, a heat death in which all motion and all distinction would cease. Others argued that if the universe contained a finite amount of matter in infinite time, then eventually every possible configuration of that matter would recur. Eduard von Hartmann argued that the universe's final state would be identical to its initial state. Eugen Düring rejected this, finding the implication of infinite repetition dangerously pessimistic. Nietzsche was aware of these debates. He read widely in the popular science of his day. In his notebooks, he even attempted to formulate the eternal return as a scientific hypothesis, calling it the most scientific of all possible hypotheses. But scholars generally agree that the scientific arguments were never the real point. The real point was always the existential challenge. The real point was always, what kind of person can say yes to this? That question receives its fullest and most dramatic treatment in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, the book Nietzsche considered his masterpiece. Written between 1883 and 1885, in furious bursts of creative energy, Zarathustra is not a conventional work of philosophy. It is a philosophical novel, a prose poem, a work of prophetic literature that draws on the structure and cadence of biblical texts while systematically overturning their content. The eternal return is, by Nietzsche's own description, the fundamental idea of the entire work. The book follows a prophet named Zarathustra, a name borrowed from the ancient Persian founder of Zoroastrianism, who descends from a mountain after 10 years of solitude to share his wisdom with humanity. But Zarathustra is not a simple mouthpiece for Nietzsche's ideas. He is a character who struggles, who doubts, who is overwhelmed by the very truths he has discovered. And nowhere is that struggle more intense than in his confrontation with the eternal return. In the chapter called The Vision and the Riddle, Zarathustra describes a scene to a group of sailors. He is climbing a steep mountain path with a dwarf sitting on his shoulder, a figure representing the spirit of gravity, the weight of pessimism and contempt. They come to a gateway inscribed with the words, "This moment." From the gateway, two paths extend in opposite directions, each stretching toward eternity. One path leads backward into the past. The other leads forward into the future. And both are infinite. This image is worth dwelling on. Picture it in your mind as you rest. A lonely path ascending through rocky terrain. The dwarf is heavy on Zarathustra's shoulders, whispering that everything falls, that everything sinks, that all rising is futile because what goes up must come down. The spirit of gravity is not just physical weight. It is the voice inside you that says nothing matters, that your efforts are wasted, that the universe is indifferent to your struggle. It is the voice of nihilism perched on the shoulders of anyone who has ever tried to climb towards something better. And then the gateway appears. This moment. Not the past, which has already happened and cannot be changed, not the future, which has not yet arrived and cannot be controlled, but this moment, the only point in time that is actually real, the narrow threshold where two eternities converge. Zarathustra looks backward along the path and sees it stretching to infinity. He looks forward and sees the same. Everything that has ever happened lies behind you. Everything that will ever happen lies before you. And you are standing at the gate. Zarathustra asks the dwarf whether these two eternities contradict each other. The dwarf responds dismissively. Everything straight lies, time itself is a circle. But Zarathustra rejects this glib response. The dwarf has reduced the most profound truth to a tired cliché. He has made eternal return into a shrug. And that is precisely what Nietzsche wants to avoid. Eternal return is not supposed to be comfortable. It is not supposed to be easy. It is supposed to be the heaviest weight imaginable, a weight that either crushes you or transforms you. The dwarf's error is the error of anyone who encounters the eternal return and says, with a yawn, so what? Nietzsche is not offering a piece of trivia about the structure of the cosmos. He is asking you to look at your actual life, with all its specific, particular, irreducible detail, and decide whether you can bear to have it repeated. The dwarf treats the circle of time as an abstraction. Zarathustra treats it as a personal confrontation. There is another extraordinary moment in this chapter that is easy to overlook. After the gateway scene, Zarathustra describes a vision of a shepherd lying on the ground with a heavy black snake hanging from his mouth. The snake has crawled inside while the shepherd was sleeping and has bitten down on his throat. The shepherd is choking, writhing, his face twisted in disgust, and Zarathustra cries out, "Bite! Bite its head off!" The shepherd bites, spits out the head of the snake, leaps to his feet, and laughs. But not a human laugh. Something golden. Something never heard on earth before. Many interpreters read this scene as an allegory for the eternal return itself. The snake is the nauseating thought that everything repeats. It has crawled inside you uninvited. It is choking you. You did not choose this confrontation, but the only way through it is an act of violent affirmation, biting off the head of your own disgust, transforming revulsion into something entirely new. The laughter that follows is the laughter of someone who has passed through the worst and come out the other side, not unscathed, but transfigured. Later in the book, in a chapter called The Convalescent, Zarathustra actually falls ill from the burden of this thought. He lies unconscious for 7 days, overwhelmed by what he has seen. When he wakes, his animals, an eagle and a serpent, try to comfort him by putting the eternal return into words. But their version is cheerful and simplistic, a kind of cosmic nursery rhyme. Zarathustra listens but does not respond. His silence suggests that the deepest truths resist easy formulation. The eternal return cannot be turned into a slogan without losing everything that makes it meaningful. And then, near the end of the book, in a passage of extraordinary lyrical power called The Drunken Song, Zarathustra finally breaks through his resistance and embraces the eternal return completely. All joy wants eternity, he declares. Wants deep eternity. This is the turning point. Zarathustra realizes that you cannot say yes to the moments of joy without also saying yes to the moments of suffering that made them possible. Joy and pain are not separate experiences that can be evaluated independently. They are woven together into a single fabric, and to love one thread, you must love them all. This brings us to what may be the most beautiful concept in all of Nietzsche's philosophy: amor fati, love of fate. In The Gay Science, section 276, Nietzsche writes, "I want to learn more and more to see as beautiful what is necessary in things. Then I shall be one of those who makes things beautiful. Let that be my love from now on. Amor fati. Amor fati is more than acceptance. It is more than stoic endurance. The Stoic said, bear what you must. Nietzsche said, love what you must. There is an enormous difference. To bear something is to carry it with gritted teeth. To love something is to open your arms to it. In Ecce Homo, his philosophical autobiography, Nietzsche states his formula for human greatness: wanting nothing to be different, not forward, not backward, not in all eternity, not merely to bear what is necessary, still less to conceal it, but to love it. This is the connection between amor fati and the eternal return. They are two faces of the same insight. If you truly love your fate, then you could endure its repetition without flinching. And if you can genuinely affirm the eternal return of your life, then you have achieved amor fati. They test each other. They complete each other. But notice how radical this is. Nietzsche is not saying that suffering is good. He is not saying that pain has some hidden purpose that makes it worthwhile. He is saying something much stranger and much braver. He is saying that the suffering is inseparable from the joy, and that to love one you must love both. The bad harvest and the good harvest come from the same field. The rejection and the creative breakthrough emerge from the same source. You cannot have the life you love without also having the life you would rather forget. This is where Nietzsche parts company with Buddhism, which seeks release from the wheel of suffering. It is where he parts company with Christianity, which promises compensation in the afterlife. It is where he parts company with Schopenhauer, who counseled resignation. Nietzsche does not want to escape the wheel. He does not want to be compensated for its turning. He wants to dance on it. Consider what this means when you apply it to the small, unglamorous realities of a human life. Amor fati does not only apply to the grand tragedies, it applies equally to the petty annoyances, the boring afternoons, the relationships that slowly fade, the ambitions that quietly die, the Sunday evenings when you feel a vague unease about the week ahead but cannot quite name its source. Can you love those moments too? Not the dramatic peaks and valleys that make for good stories, but the vast stretches of ordinary time that constitute most of what a life actually is. There is something profoundly liberating in this idea, if you can let it in. So much of our suffering comes not from our actual circumstances, but from our resistance to them. We fight against what is. We wish things were different. We replay past decisions, looking for the moment where we could have turned left instead of right. We project into the future, looking for the life we are supposed to be living, rather than the one we are actually living. Amor fati cuts through all of that. It says, this is what happened. This is what is happening. Can you find within yourself the generosity of spirit to not merely accept it, but to embrace it? Nietzsche was under no illusion that this was easy. He himself struggled with it constantly. His letters are full of complaints about his health, about his loneliness, about the world's indifference to his work. He was not some enlightened sage floating serenely above the storms of human emotion. He was a man in pain, trying to forge a philosophy strong enough to carry that pain without being crushed by it. And that is precisely what makes his achievements so moving. Amor fati is not a recipe for happiness. It is a discipline of honesty. It is the refusal to lie to yourself about the nature of your situation, combined with the determination to find within that situation something worth affirming. The eternal return also connects intimately with another of Nietzsche's central concepts, the Übermensch, often translated as the overman or the beyond human. The Übermensch is not a biological Superman in the comic book sense. Nietzsche would have been horrified by that interpretation. The Übermensch is a vision of what a human being might become once freed from the need for external sources of meaning. Once you accept that there is no God setting the rules, no cosmic judge tallying your virtues and vices, no heaven where everything will be made right, then you are thrown back entirely upon yourself. You must create your own values. You must find your own reasons to get up in the morning. The Übermensch is the being who can do this joyfully. And the test of whether that joy is genuine, rather than a pose or a delusion, is the eternal return. Can you create meaning that you would be willing to create again, forever? Can you build a life that you would choose to live again unchanged? The Übermensch is not someone who has achieved perfection. The Übermensch is someone who has achieved wholeness, someone who can look at the entire package of their existence, triumphs and disasters alike, and say yes. This is why Nietzsche needed both concepts. The eternal return, without the Übermensch, would simply be a cruel cosmic joke, an endless repetition of suffering inflicted on creatures too weak to bear it. The Übermensch without the eternal return would be a pleasant fantasy, a vision of human excellence with no real test of its sincerity. Together they form a challenge of extraordinary depth. Become the kind of person for whom the repetition of existence is not a curse, but a blessing. Not by changing the world to suit your preferences, but by changing yourself until your preferences align with reality. There is a subtle and important distinction here that many readers of Nietzsche miss. The eternal return does not ask whether you would design a perfect life and then live it forever. That would be too easy. It asks whether you would live this life, the one you have actually lived, with all its mistakes and missed opportunities and moments of cowardice and cruelty, whether you would live this one forever. The challenge is not to imagine an ideal existence, but to affirm the actual existence you have been given. In Zarathustra, Nietzsche describes the three metamorphoses of the spirit. First, the spirit becomes a camel, a beast of burden that takes on the heavy loads of tradition, duty, and inherited values. The camel says, "Load me up, I will carry it." Then, the camel transforms into a lion, a fierce creature that says no to everything the camel accepted. The lion destroys old values. It clears the ground. But the lion cannot create new values. Destruction alone does not produce meaning. Finally, the lion becomes a child, and the child is the key. The child is innocence and forgetting, a new beginning, a game, a wheel that rolls out of itself, a first movement, a sacred yes-saying. The child does not create meaning through grim determination. The child creates through play, through delight, through the sheer overflow of creative energy. And it is the child who can say yes to the eternal return, because the child does not experience repetition as burden. Think of how children behave. They want to hear the same story again. They want to play the same game again. They want to ride the same ride again, read it again, they say, do it again, 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 again. The child finds joy in repetition, not despite the sameness, but because of it. Each return is not a weary retracing of familiar ground, but a fresh encounter with something beloved. The story does not grow stale with repetition. It deepens. The game does not lose its charm. It reveals new dimensions. This is what Nietzsche is pointing toward. A mode of being in which life is not a problem to be solved, but a game to be played. Not a sentence to be endured, but a dance to be danced. Over and over, with increasing love and skill and abandon. The child is not naive. The child does not deny that the world contains suffering, but the child has not yet learned to resent existence for its imperfections. The child still knows how to say yes, without conditions, without the exhausting calculations of advantage and disadvantage that consume the adult mind. And now, to feel the full personal weight of what Nietzsche was proposing, we need to look at one of the most painful chapters of his own life. Because philosophy for Nietzsche was never separate from the philosopher who wrote it. The ideas were forged in the fire of experience, and the experience that tested the eternal return most severely was the story of Lou Salomé. In the spring of 1882, Nietzsche was introduced to a young Russian woman named Lou von Salomé through his friend Paul Rie and the writer Malwida von Meysenbug. Lou was 21 years old, brilliant, ferociously independent, and intellectually daring in a way that few women of her era were permitted to be. She spoke multiple languages. She had rejected conventional expectations about marriage and domesticity. She was interested in ideas at the highest level, and she was not intimidated by the reputations of the famous men who surrounded her. Nietzsche was captivated. Here, at last, was someone who might understand him, someone who could match the velocity of his thinking. The three of them, Nietzsche, Rie, and Lou, formed an intellectual triangle and began planning an extraordinary experiment. They would live together in a kind of secular commune devoted entirely to philosophy and learning. No romantic entanglements, no bourgeois conventions, just three minds in dialogue. But Nietzsche could not keep the boundaries he had agreed to. He fell in love with Lou. Not casually, not as an intellectual exercise, but with the desperate intensity of a lonely man who believed he had found the person who could rescue him from his isolation. He asked Rie to propose marriage to Lou on his behalf. She declined. He proposed to her directly during a meeting in Lucerne. She declined again. She cared about him as a thinker and as a friend, but she did not love him as he loved her. and she had no intention of surrendering her freedom to become anyone's wife. The situation deteriorated quickly. Nietzsche's sister Elizabeth, who was fiercely protective of her brother and deeply suspicious of Lou, began a campaign of sabotage. She wrote letters to Nietzsche's mother, full of exaggerated and invented scandals. She contacted Lou's family. She poisoned every well she could find. The intellectual commune fell apart. Rie and Lou departed for Berlin together, and Nietzsche was left alone with his heartbreak, his fury at his sister, and a depression so deep that he reportedly contemplated taking his own life. The letters he wrote during this period are among the most painful in all of philosophical correspondence. He oscillated between rage and despair, between blaming Lou and blaming himself, between declaring that he was well rid of both of them, and confessing that he had never felt more alone. He wrote to his friend Overbeck that he felt a genuine hatred for his sister, whose meddling had accelerated the collapse of the relationship. He wrote letters to Lou that were never sent, full of accusations and self-justification, and beneath it all the unmistakable sound of a heart that had been broken for what might have been the last time. What makes this episode so significant is not just the personal suffering, though that was real and severe, it is the timing. Nietzsche had already formulated the eternal return. He had already written section 341 of the Gay Science. He had already asked the question about the demon and the infinite repetition, and now life itself was administering the test. Could he look at this humiliation, this loneliness, this rejection by the one person he believed could understand him, and say yes to its eternal recurrence? Now, imagine this moment through the lens of the eternal return. Here is a man who has just proposed to the world the most radical formula for affirming existence ever conceived, and here he is, devastated by a rejection that exposes the gap between his philosophy and his emotional reality. Could he say yes to this pain? Could he love this fate? Could he will this heartbreak to repeat, unchanged, for all eternity? What happened next suggests something remarkable about the relationship between suffering and creation in Nietzsche's life. In January and February of 1883, barely 2 months after the final break with Lou, Nietzsche wrote the first part of Thus Spoke Zarathustra. He wrote it in approximately 10 days. 10 days to produce one of the most extraordinary works of philosophy in the Western tradition. The subsequent parts followed in similar bursts over the next 2 years, and the period between the loss of Lou and his final breakdown in 1889 was, despite or perhaps because of the pain, the most productive period of his entire career. Beyond Good and Evil. On the Genealogy of Morals, Twilight of the Idols, The Antichrist, Ecce Homo, all of them poured out of a man who was simultaneously reaching the peak of his creative powers and descending into illness and isolation. This is the awful and beautiful logic of amor fati made flesh. The rejection that nearly destroyed Nietzsche also catalyzed his greatest work. The suffering and the achievement cannot be separated. If you remove the pain, you remove the art. If you refuse to love the fate that included Lou Salomé's rejection, you must also refuse to love Thus Spoke Zarathustra. They are the same fate. They are the same return. And this brings us to a question that feels much closer to home than ancient Greek cosmology or 19th century German philosophy. What does the eternal return mean for you? Not as a concept to admire from a distance, but as a practice to apply to the texture of your daily life. Albert Camus, the French-Algerian philosopher who wrote The Myth of Sisyphus in 1942, drew deeply on the same well that Nietzsche had tapped. Camus imagined Sisyphus, the figure from Greek mythology, condemned to push a boulder up a hill only to watch it roll back down, repeating this labor for eternity. And then Camus made a claim that still startles readers. One must imagine Sisyphus happy, not because the task is pleasant, not because some hidden reward awaits at the end, but because the act of continuing, of choosing to push the boulder again, of refusing despair, is itself a form of rebellion against meaninglessness. We must imagine Sisyphus happy because his happiness is the only victory available in a universe that does not care whether he succeeds or fails. Viktor Frankl, the Austrian psychiatrist who survived the Nazi concentration camps, arrived at a similar insight through experience rather than thought experiment. In the camps, Frankl observed that the prisoners who survived longest were not necessarily the strongest or the healthiest, but those who maintained a sense of meaning, a reason to endure. Meaning, Frankl concluded, is not something the universe provides. It is something we create, even in the most horrifying circumstances. The eternal return, applied to the experience of the camps, asks, could anyone say yes to that? And Frankl's answer, hard and complicated, and not at all comfortable, was that meaning persists even in suffering, if we choose to find it there. In our own less extreme lives, the eternal return still has teeth. Think about your morning routine. The alarm goes off, you rise, you make the same coffee, you follow the same path to work, you perform the same tasks, you come home, you eat, you rest. And tomorrow, the same cycle begins again. For most of us, this repetition is the source of a low-grade existential unease. We scroll through our phones looking for novelty. We plan vacations to break the pattern. We daydream about different lives, different choices, different versions of ourselves. The eternal return confronts this unease directly. What if there is no escape from the pattern? What if the novelty you seek is just another form of avoidance? What if the task is not to break the cycle, but to inhabit it so fully that repetition becomes something closer to ritual than routine? The difference between routine and ritual is intention. Routine is what you do without thinking. Ritual is what you do with attention and presence. Making your morning coffee can be a mindless habit or a small act of care for yourself, depending entirely on the quality of consciousness you bring to it. There is a passage in the Zen Buddhist tradition where a student asks the master what enlightenment looks like in daily life. The master responds, before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. The activities do not change. What changes is the quality of awareness with which they are performed. Nietzsche, who was no Buddhist, would nevertheless have understood this perfectly. The eternal return does not demand that you revolutionize your life. It demands that you wake up inside the life you already have. Consider how this applies to the way we relate to our own past. Most of us carry regrets like stones in our pockets, pulling them out from time to time to weigh and examine, wishing we had acted differently at this moment or that. The eternal return offers a radical alternative to regret. If everything must return exactly as it was, then your mistakes are eternal. But so are the lessons you drew from them. So is the person those mistakes made you. You cannot remove the bad choices without also removing everything that grew from them. And if you love who you are now, you must love the entire path that brought you here, including the detours and the dead ends and the stretches where you were utterly lost. This is not the same as saying that all choices are equally good. Nietzsche was no moral relativist. He was fiercely committed to the idea that some ways of living are nobler, more creative, more fully alive than others. The eternal return does not eliminate moral judgment. It deepens it. Because if you know that this choice will be yours forever, you will choose more carefully. You will choose as though everything depends on it, because in the framework of eternal return, everything does. This is what the eternal return is really asking. Not whether the universe will literally repeat, but whether you are living with enough presence and intention that repetition would be welcome rather than dreaded. Are you awake inside your own life, or are you waiting for the real life to begin? The film Groundhog Day, released in 1993, is perhaps popular culture's most direct and most charming engagement with this idea. Bill Murray's character, a cynical weatherman named Phil Connors, finds himself trapped in a single day that repeats endlessly. At first, he is horrified. Then he exploits the situation for pleasure, eating whatever he wants, pursuing women without consequence, living as though nothing matters because nothing sticks. Then, when even pleasure becomes boring, he falls into despair. He tries to end his life in increasingly dramatic ways, but even death does not break the cycle. He wakes up again on the same morning, to the same song on the radio, to the same cheerful greeting from the same bed and breakfast owner. What finally liberates him is not escape, but transformation. He begins to use the repeated day to learn. He studies piano, starting from nothing and practicing for what amounts to years within the loop. He learns to ice sculpt, He memorizes the details of other people's lives so he can help them at exactly the right moment, catching a child falling from a tree, performing the Heimlich maneuver on a choking man, changing a flat tire for elderly women. He falls genuinely in love, not with the idea of love, but with a specific person whose goodness he gradually learns to appreciate through the accumulation of repeated encounters. And it is only when he has learned to live this single day with absolute fullness, with creativity and generosity and presence, that the cycle breaks and the next day finally arrives. The film never explains the mechanics of the time loop. It does not need to. The loop is beside the point. The point is the transformation it enables. This is the eternal return dramatized as comedy. But the insight at its core is the same one Nietzsche offered in 1882. The way out of the prison of repetition is not escape. It is love. Love of the day. Love of the moment. Love of the imperfect, limited, recurring reality of being alive. Phil Connors could not change the day. He could only change himself. And in changing himself, the day changed, not in its external circumstances, but in its meaning. The same events that had been a prison became a playground, a canvas, an opportunity for an increasingly generous and attentive life. There is a lesson here that applies far beyond the cinema. Most of us live in our own version of Groundhog Day. The days blend together, the weeks repeat their patterns, and the temptation is always to believe that real life is happening somewhere else, in some future version of ourselves that has figured everything out, in some different set of circumstances that will finally make everything click into place. The eternal return says, there is no somewhere else. There is only here. There is only now. And the quality of your existence depends not on what happens to you, but on the depth of attention and care you bring to what is already happening. As you lie here tonight, settling into the quiet rhythms of approaching sleep, consider this. This moment, right now, with the weight of the blanket on your body, and the sound of these words in your ears, and the slow steadying of your breath, this moment is happening. It is real. It is yours. And whether or not it will ever repeat, the question Nietzsche asks is whether you could welcome its repetition, not as punishment, not as resignation, but as confirmation that this particular configuration of consciousness, this particular instant of awareness in the vast darkness of the cosmos, is worthy of eternity. The final chapter of Nietzsche's own story provides a devastating test of his own philosophy. On January 3rd, 1889, in the Italian city of Turin, Nietzsche was walking through the Piazza Carlo Alberto when he witnessed a scene that seems almost too symbolic to be true. A coachman was beating his horse. The animal was straining, suffering, unable to pull its load, and something in Nietzsche broke. He ran to the horse, threw his arms around its neck, and collapsed. He never recovered. There is something about this scene that refuses to stay in the realm of historical fact and insists on becoming myth. The philosopher who had written about the cruelty of nature, who had analyzed the will to power in all its manifestations, who had urged humanity to become hard, saw a suffering animal and could not bear it. The man who had declared that the world was beyond good and evil threw himself into the street to protect a creature that could not protect itself. Whether or not the details are exactly as tradition has recorded them, the emotional truth of the scene is unmistakable. At the end, the thinker who had pushed the boundaries of human thought further than almost anyone before him was undone by the simplest of human responses: compassion for a fellow creature in pain. In the days that followed, he wrote a series of bizarre letters to friends and public figures, signing them with the names Dionysus or the Crucified. He claimed to be God. He claimed to have created the world. He wrote to Cosima Wagner, the wife of his former friend, letters of incoherent grandeur. He wrote to the King of Italy and to the Vatican. His handwriting, once precise and elegant, had become wild and barely legible. His friend Franz Overbeck, a theology professor at Basel who had remained loyal through all the years of Nietzsche's wandering, received one of these letters and was immediately alarmed. He traveled to Turin as quickly as he could. What he found was a man unrecognizable. Nietzsche was alternately raving and silent, playing Wagner on the piano for hours at a time, with a violence that frightened his landlord, weeping and shouting and claiming to be conducting the cosmos. Overbeck managed to get him to a clinic in Basel, where he was examined and diagnosed. He was then transferred to a clinic in Jena, where the diagnosis was confirmed. Friedrich Nietzsche, at the age of 44, had suffered a complete and irreversible mental collapse. His mother cared for him until her death in 1897. Then his sister Elizabeth took over. And here the story takes an especially bitter turn. Elizabeth Forster Nietzsche, who had married a prominent anti-Semite named Bernhard Forster and followed him to a failed colonial project in Paraguay, seized control of her brother's literary estate. She edited his unpublished notebooks. She compiled and published a book called The Will to Power, arranging fragments of his writing to support interpretations that Nietzsche himself would have found repugnant. She cultivated relationships with German nationalists. In 1934, she invited Adolf Hitler to the Nietzsche archive in Weimar and presented him with her brother's walking stick. The philosopher who had written with contempt about German nationalism, who had severed friendships over anti-Semitism, who had renounced his own Prussian citizenship, was posthumously conscripted into the service of the very ideology he despised. It took decades of careful scholarship to recover Nietzsche's authentic thought from his sister's distortions. Walter Kaufmann's translations and interpretations beginning in the 1950s were particularly important in presenting Nietzsche to the English-speaking world as a complex and deeply humane thinker rather than the cartoon villain of fascist propaganda. Nietzsche died on August 25, 1900 in Weimar. He was 55 years old but had not produced a coherent thought in over a decade. He was buried beside his father in Rocken, the village where he was born, the son of a dead pastor, laid to rest next to the man whose death had set the entire story in motion. And here, inevitably, we must ask the question that Nietzsche's own philosophy demands we ask. Could he have said yes to this? To all of it? The childhood losses, the chronic pain, the loneliness, the rejected love, the ignored books, the mental collapse, the 11 years of silence, the posthumous betrayal by his own sister. Could Friedrich Nietzsche, standing beside that pyramidal boulder in August of 1881, have foreseen all of this and still whispered, "You are a god, and never have I heard anything more divine"? We cannot know, but what we know is that he tried. He tried harder than almost any human being has ever tried to say yes to existence as it is, without editing, without excuses, without the comfort of believing that someone or something would eventually make it all worthwhile. And the attempt itself, regardless of whether it succeeded, is among the most moving and courageous gestures in the history of human thought. His legacy endures far beyond the academy. Existentialist philosophers like Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir built upon his insistence that meaning must be created rather than discovered. Postmodern thinkers drew on his skepticism about absolute truth. Psychologists from Alfred Adler to the practitioners of modern cognitive behavioral therapy have found in his idea of self-overcoming a model for therapeutic change. Even popular culture continues to wrestle with the eternal return. In films and novels and conversations that may never mention Nietzsche by name, but carry his fingerprints nonetheless. Martin Heidegger, one of the 20th century's most important philosophers, devoted years of his career to interpreting Nietzsche and considered the eternal return to be one of the essential questions of Western metaphysics. Karl Jaspers, the existentialist psychiatrist, saw in Nietzsche's thought a confrontation with the limits of reason that every honest thinker must eventually face. Gilles Deleuze, the French philosopher, reinterpreted the eternal return as a principle of difference rather than sameness, arguing that what returns is not the identical, but the creative power of becoming. Each generation of thinkers has found in this single idea a new challenge, a new provocation, a new mirror in which to examine their own assumptions about what it means to be alive. Perhaps most remarkably, Nietzsche's thought continues to speak to people who have never read a word of his philosophy. When someone who is struggling with a difficult decision asks themselves whether they would make this choice again if they had to live this day over, they are thinking Nietzsche's thought without knowing it. When someone who has suffered a devastating loss finds themselves months or years later grateful for the depth of character that the suffering produced, they are practicing amor fati. When someone refuses to defer their deepest commitments to some hypothetical future and instead chooses to invest fully in the present moment, They are answering the demon's question with a yes. The eternal return does not belong to philosophy departments. It belongs to anyone who has ever lain awake in the dark and wondered whether their life has been worth living. It belongs to anyone who has felt the weight of repetition and wondered whether there might be a way to transform it from burden into gift. And here, as consciousness begins to soften and the borders between waking and sleep grow less distinct, we arrive at the gentlest and perhaps the most personal application of everything we have explored tonight. Sleep itself is a kind of eternal return. Every night you lie down, every night consciousness fades. Every night you surrender control and trust the body to do its quiet work of repair and renewal. And every morning you return. The same person and yet subtly changed. The same life and yet moved forward by one day. This nightly cycle, so ordinary that you rarely think about it, contains in miniature the same structure that fascinated Nietzsche on such a grand scale. Return, repetition. The question of whether you meet it with dread or with welcome. The alarm will sound tomorrow morning and the day will begin again. The coffee, the commute, the conversations, the small victories and small frustrations that constitute a human life. And the eternal return asks simply, is this the day you would choose? And if not, what would you change? Not in some dramatic, life-overturning way. Nietzsche was not advocating recklessness. He was advocating attention, presence, the willingness to inhabit your own existence rather than sleepwalking through it. The willingness to look at the spider and the moonlight and the mundane details of your unremarkable Tuesday afternoon and say, yes, this too, even this. As your breathing slows and the words begin to blur gently at their edges, notice the quality of this particular moment. The weight of the covers, the temperature of the air on your skin, the distant sounds of the world going on without your participation. These details, these tiny, specific, unrepeatable details, are what the eternal return is ultimately about. Not grand cosmic cycles or abstract philosophical arguments, but the concrete texture of being alive, in a body, in a place, at a time, surrounded by objects and people and memories that belong to no one else in the universe but you. Nietzsche spent much of his life in physical pain. He spent much of it alone. He spent much of it writing books that no one would read during his sane lifetime. And yet he looked at the whole of this imperfect, painful, extraordinary existence and declared it worthy of eternal repetition. That is not the statement of a man who has figured everything out. It is the statement of a man who has decided to stop waiting for everything to be figured out before he begins to live. As you drift now toward the deeper rhythms of sleep, carry with you this thought from a lonely, brilliant, suffering man who stood beside a glacial lake in the Swiss Alps and dared to imagine that this life, with all its flaws and all its pain and all its fleeting beauty, might be worth living forever. Not because it is perfect, but because it is yours. The eternal return is not a punishment, it is an invitation to live so deliberately, so fully, so honestly that the prospect of doing it all again does not horrify you but fills you with something close to gratitude. The lakes of the Upper Engadine are still there, turquoise and cold and silent. The pyramidal boulder still stands beside Lake Silvaplana, unmoved by the passage of 140 years. Hikers sometimes stop beside it and read the plaque that commemorates Nietzsche's revelation. They stand where he stood, they look out at the same mountains, and perhaps if they are very quiet, they can feel some faint echo of the thought that shook a solitary philosopher to his foundations on a summer day in 1881. The thought is still alive. It lives wherever someone pauses in the middle of an ordinary day and asks whether they are really living or merely passing through. It lives wherever someone refuses to defer their deepest commitments and instead plants both feet firmly in the present moment. It lives wherever someone looks at their life with all its imperfections and chooses it fully, chooses it forever. Tomorrow the sun will rise and the world will ask you again to choose. Choose well. Choose as though your choice were forever. And now, let the stillness settle around you. Let the questions rest. They will be there in the morning, patient and ancient, waiting for you to take them up again. Nietzsche's gift was never a set of answers. It was a way of asking that makes every moment feel like it matters, because it does, because it always did, because whether or not the cosmos truly repeats, you are here now, alive, aware, resting in the dark, and that is already something extraordinary. The hourglass turns, the sand falls, and in the silence between one grain and the next, there is room for everything you have ever been and everything you might yet become. Rest in that space tonight. Let it hold you. Let it carry you gently into whatever dreams are waiting. If this journey has given you something to carry into tomorrow, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to this channel. Share it with a friend who might need this kind of quiet company in the night. And let me know in the comments where in the world you are listening from. I love knowing that these old ideas are still finding their way to new minds scattered across the earth, each one lying in their own darkness, each one asking their own version of the same ancient question. Rest well, dear friends. And remember, the eternal hourglass is always turning. Make this turn count. Good night.